Long before the first European ships ever touched the shores of the American continent, long before the concept of nations and borders carved the land into pieces, there existed a people who believed that language itself was a gift from the holy people, the divine beings who created the world. They called themselves the Dene, the people. The world would come to know them as the Navajo. Their homeland stretched across the vast, breathtaking expanse of the American Southwest, a landscape of towering red mesas, endless desert plains, deep canyons carved by ancient rivers, and skies so wide and blue they seemed to swallow the earth. This land, known as Deneta, was bounded by 4 sacred mountains: Blanca Peak to the east, Mount Taylor to the south, the San Francisco Peaks to the west, and Hesperus Peak to the north. Between these mountains, the Navajo lived, prayed, herded their sheep, and passed down their stories from generation to generation, mouth to ear, elder to child, in an unbroken chain that stretched back thousands of years. Their language, Dene Bizad, was unlike almost anything else on the face of the earth. It did not belong to any of the major language families that linguists had neatly categorized. It was part of the Athabascan language family, a group so small and so isolated that only a handful of related tongues existed, scattered across remote parts of North America. But even among Athabascan languages, Navajo stood apart. It was a language of extraordinary complexity, of tonal shifts that could change the meaning of a word with the slightest rise or fall of the voice, of verb structure so intricate that a single Navajo verb could express what might take an entire English sentence to convey. The language had no written form. There was no Navajo alphabet, no Navajo dictionary sitting on a library shelf in Berlin or Tokyo. It existed purely in the breath and voice of its speakers, carried on the wind across the desert, whispered in hogans during long winter nights, chanted in ceremonies that could last 9 days and 9 nights. And this beautiful, ancient, impossibly complex language that had been carried in the hearts of the Dene for millennia would one day become the most powerful secret weapon in the history of modern warfare. But that story begins not in the peaceful canyons of Deneta. It begins in the fire and blood of a world gone mad. Chapter 2: The World on Fire. December 7th, 1941. It was a quiet Sunday morning on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. Sailors aboard the battleships moored at Pearl Harbor were waking slowly, some writing letters home, some preparing for church services, some simply enjoying the warm tropical air. At 7:48 a.m., the sky screamed. 353 Japanese aircraft, bombers, torpedo planes, fighters descended upon Pearl Harbor in 2 devastating waves. The attack lasted just under 2 hours, but in those 110 minutes, the world changed forever. 8 American battleships were damaged, 4 were sunk. 188 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 2,403 Americans were killed. 1,178 were wounded. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was at war. But the war in the Pacific would prove to be unlike anything the American military had ever faced. The Japanese imperial forces were disciplined, fanatical, and brilliant. Their soldiers had been raised in a culture that glorified death in battle, that considered surrender the ultimate dishonor. They fought with a ferocity that stunned and terrified the American troops who faced them. And they had another advantage, one that was causing the American military a very serious, very dangerous problem. They were breaking American codes.
Every military operation depends on communication. Commanders must send orders to their troops. Units must coordinate their movements. Artillery batteries must receive targeting coordinates. Supply lines must be organized. Intelligence must be shared. And all of this communication must happen quickly, accurately, and critically, secretly. The American military used a variety of codes and ciphers to encrypt their communications. These ranged from simple substitution ciphers to complex machine-generated codes. Military cryptographers worked around the clock to create codes that would be unbreakable, but the Japanese were breaking them. Japan's military intelligence had assembled some of the finest cryptanalysts in the world. These men were linguistic geniuses, mathematicians of extraordinary ability, puzzle solvers of almost supernatural skill. They had studied at the finest universities. They had spent years learning English, studying American communication patterns, analyzing the mathematical structures underlying American codes, and they were devastatingly effective. Time after time, American operations in the Pacific were compromised. Ambushes were sprung on forces that should have had the element of surprise. Supply convoys were intercepted. Beach landings were met with walls of fire from defenders who seemed to know exactly where and when the Americans would arrive. The Americans would create a new code. The Japanese would break it. Sometimes in hours, sometimes in days, but always, inevitably, they would break it. It was as if the enemy were reading American mail. The situation was becoming desperate. American Marines were dying, not just from the inherent dangers of war, but from the catastrophic failure of their communication security. Every order sent by radio was a potential death sentence because there was no guarantee that the enemy wasn't listening, understanding, and preparing. The military needed a solution, and that solution would come from the unlikeliest source imaginable. Part 2. The Idea. Chapter 3. Philip Johnston's Revelation. In early 1942, a man named Philip Johnston sat in his home in Los Angeles, California, reading the newspaper. The headlines were grim. More losses in the Pacific, more ships sunk, more young men dead. Johnston read about the military's communication problems with a growing recognition because Philip Johnston knew something that almost no one else in the entire United States military establishment knew. He knew the Navajo language. Johnston was not Navajo himself. He was a white man, the son of Protestant missionaries who had spent decades living among the Navajo people on their reservation. Philip had grown up among Navajo children. He had played their games, eaten their food, listened to their stories, and he had learned their language, not perfectly, not with the fluency of a native speaker, but well enough to understand its extraordinary complexity, its tonal subtleties, its bewildering grammatical structures. Johnston was one of perhaps 30 non-Navajo people on the entire planet who had any meaningful ability to speak the language. And as he read about the Japanese breaking American codes, a thought struck him with the force of a thunderbolt. What if the American military used the Navajo language as a code?
The idea was elegant in its simplicity. A code based on a language that the enemy had never heard, never studied, never encountered. A language with no written form, no published grammar, no dictionary. A language spoken by fewer than 50,000 people, virtually all of whom lived within the borders of the United States. A language so complex, so alien to European and Asian ears, that even trained linguists who studied it for years could barely grasp its fundamentals. Johnston's mind raced. He thought about the speed advantage. Machine codes took time. A message had to be encrypted, transmitted, received, and then decrypted. The process could take 30 minutes or more for a complex message. But a voice code, a code spoken directly into a radio by a native speaker, could be transmitted and understood almost instantly.
On a battlefield, where seconds meant the difference between life and death, that speed could be revolutionary. He thought about the security advantage. The Japanese had studied English. They had studied American code systems. They had captured American code machines. But Navajo? The Japanese had never even heard of the Navajo. There was no Navajo-Japanese dictionary. There were no Navajo speakers in Japan or in any Japanese-occupied territory. The language was, for all practical purposes, invisible to the enemy. Johnston contacted the United States Marine Corps and requested a meeting. He was granted an audience with Major General Clayton B. Vogel, the commanding general of Amphibious Corps Pacific Fleet, at Camp Elliott near San Diego. The meeting almost didn't happen. Military officers were skeptical. The idea sounded bizarre, impractical, the fantasy of a civilian who didn't understand the realities of military communication. But Johnston was persistent, and he was persuasive, and eventually he was given 15 minutes to make his case. He brought 4 Navajo men with him to the demonstration. In front of the assembled officers, Johnston conducted a test. He gave a message in English to one Navajo speaker, who translated it into Navajo and transmitted it by radio to another Navajo speaker in a different room, who translated it back into English. The message was transmitted and received perfectly, and it took a fraction of the time that conventional encoding methods required. The officers were stunned. General Vogel immediately recommended a pilot program to the Commandant of the Marine Corps. The recommendation was approved. The Marine Corps would recruit 30 Navajo men for a top-secret program. The Code Talkers were about to be born. Chapter 4. The Cruel Irony. But here is where the story takes a turn that is both darkly ironic and deeply painful, a turn that reveals uncomfortable truths about the nation these young Navajo men were being asked to defend. For generations, the United States government had waged a systematic campaign to destroy the Navajo language. Beginning in the late 1800s, Navajo children, some as young as 5 years old, were forcibly removed from their families and sent to government-run boarding schools. The explicit, stated purpose of these schools was, in the chilling words of Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the first such institution, to kill the Indian and save the man. At these schools, Navajo children were forbidden to speak their language. They were punished, physically, brutally, if they were caught uttering a single word of Diné Bizad. Their hair was cut, their traditional clothing was taken, their names were replaced with English names. They were beaten with rulers, locked in closets, had their mouths washed with soap, all for the crime of speaking the language their mothers and fathers had spoken to them since birth. The goal was total assimilation, the complete erasure of Navajo identity, culture, and language. And the policy had been devastatingly effective. By the 1940s, many young Navajo people had been stripped of their linguistic heritage. Many could no longer speak their own language fluently. And now the very government that had tried to beat the Navajo language out of existence was coming to the Navajo people and saying, "We need your language. We need it to save American lives. We need it to win the war." The irony was staggering. The language that had been condemned as primitive, as savage, as an obstacle to civilization, was now recognized as something so sophisticated, so complex, so utterly unique that the finest code breakers on earth could not crack it. And the Navajo people, despite everything, despite the broken treaties, the stolen land, the forced marches, the boarding schools, the poverty, the discrimination, said yes. They said yes because they were patriots. They said yes because Diné Ta, their sacred homeland, was part of America. And if America was threatened, then Diné Ta was threatened. They said yes because their warrior tradition ran deep, because courage and sacrifice were woven into the fabric of their culture. They said yes because they believed that by serving, by fighting, by proving their loyalty and their worth, they might finally earn the respect and the rights that had been denied to them for so long. And so, in the spring of 1942, 29 young Navajo men, the original 29 as they would come to be known, reported to the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, California. They were about to change the course of history. Part 3. Forging the Code. Chapter 5. Boot Camp, Proving Their Worth. The 29 Navajo recruits arrived at boot camp and immediately faced a wall of prejudice. Many of their white fellow recruits had never seen a Native American in person. Some held deeply racist views. Others were simply ignorant. The drill instructors, hardened Marines who prided themselves on treating all recruits with equal brutality, nevertheless harbored doubts about whether these quiet, dark-skinned men from the desert could cut it as Marines. The Navajo recruits answered every doubt with action. They were, almost to a man, in superb physical condition. Life on the reservation, herding sheep across miles of rough terrain, hauling water, working the land, had made them strong, resilient, and accustomed to hardship. They excelled at the physical challenges of boot camp. They could march farther, endure more, and push through pain that broke other recruits. They were also natural marksmen. Many had grown up hunting to feed their families, and they brought to the rifle range a steady hand and a keen eye that impressed even the skeptical instructors. But it was after boot camp that their true mission began. The 29 Navajo men were transferred to a classified location and given an assignment unlike anything in the history of military communication. They were told to create a code based on the Navajo language, but not simply a translation. The code had to be a double layer of encryption. Navajo words that stood for English military terms, arranged in a system that would be impenetrable even to a Navajo speaker who hadn't been trained in the code. This was crucial. The military understood that if the Japanese somehow captured a Navajo who wasn't a code talker, that person would not be able to understand the coded messages, because the code wasn't just Navajo, it was a code within a code. Chapter 6. Building the Unbreakable Code. The 29 men sat down together and began the extraordinary intellectual task of creating a military communication system from scratch. They started with the alphabet. Each letter of the English alphabet was assigned a Navajo word, but not just one word. To prevent pattern recognition, each letter was given multiple Navajo equivalents. The letter A, for example, could be represented by WWII, ant, Belasana, apple, or Tsenil, axe. When spelling out a word, a code talker could use any of the three options, making frequency analysis, the most basic tool of code breaking, virtually impossible. Then they tackled military terminology. Hundreds of terms needed Navajo equivalents, but the Navajo language had no words for tanks, submarines, aircraft carriers, or bombs. So the code talkers created them, using metaphors drawn from the natural world they knew so intimately.
A submarine became beshlo, iron fish. A tank became che dagahi, tortoise. A bomber aircraft became yesho, buzzard. A fighter plane became dahe-ti-hi, hummingbird. A battleship became lo-tso, whale. A destroyer became kalo, shark. A grenade became nima-si, potatoes. A bomb became ayeshi, eggs. America became nehema, our mother. The code was poetic, beautiful, and devastatingly effective. Each term was chosen not randomly, but with careful thought about its metaphorical resonance. A dive bomber was gini, chicken hawk, because it dove from the sky to strike its prey. A commanding general was bkhe,
war chief. An observation plane was ne-as-ja, owl, because it watched from above. The 29 men memorized the entire code. There was no written code book. The code existed only in their minds. This was another layer of security. If a code talker was captured, there would be no physical document for the enemy to seize. The code lived and died with its speakers. After weeks of development and testing, the code was ready. The Marine Corps conducted a formal evaluation, pitting the Navajo Code against the fastest machine encryption systems available. The results were astonishing. A message that took a machine operator 30 minutes to encode, transmit, and decode took a Navajo Code talker just 20 seconds. 20 seconds versus 30 minutes. On a battlefield, that wasn't just an advantage, it was the difference between existence and annihilation. The Marine Corps immediately authorized the expansion of the program. More Navajo men were recruited, trained, and deployed. By the end of the war, between 380 and 420 Navajo Code talkers would serve in the United States Marine Corps, operating in every major operation in the Pacific Theater. Part 4. Baptism of Fire. Chapter 7. Guadalcanal, the First Test. The first code talkers deployed to the Pacific Theater arrived at Guadalcanal in late 1942. The battle for this tiny atoll in the Gilbert Islands chain in the Solomon Islands chain was one of the most brutal amphibious assaults of the entire war. A grinding, months-long struggle in which American Marines fought the Japanese for every yard of jungle, every hill, every river crossing. The code talkers were assigned to Marine communication units, working in pairs. One would be stationed at a forward position, often terrifyingly close to the front lines, while the other would be at a command post in the rear. Messages would be spoken in Navajo code over field radios, received by the partner, decoded, and delivered to the commanding officer. The system worked flawlessly from the very first transmission. But the code talkers faced challenges beyond the technical. They faced the challenge of survival. They were Marines, and they were on the front lines, and the Japanese were trying to kill them. They endured everything their fellow Marines endured: the shelling, the snipers, the banzai charges, the tropical diseases, the soul-crushing fear that comes from knowing that death can arrive at any moment from any direction. And they faced a unique, terrifying additional danger, because the code talkers looked, to many American eyes, like they could be Japanese. In the chaos of combat, in the smoke and confusion of a firefight, American soldiers sometimes mistook their own code talkers for enemy infiltrators. Several code talkers were nearly shot by their own comrades. Some were detained, questioned, even roughed up by Americans who couldn't believe or couldn't accept that a brown-skinned, dark-haired man could be a United States Marine. The Marine Corps addressed this problem by assigning bodyguards to the code talkers. These bodyguards had an official mission: protect the code talker at all costs. But there was an unofficial, unspoken second part of their mission that chilled everyone who knew about it. If a code talker was about to be captured by the enemy, the bodyguard was to kill him. The code could not fall into enemy hands, and the code existed only inside the minds of the code talkers. The code talkers knew this, they accepted it, and they went on doing their job. Chapter 8. The Enemy Listens. On the Japanese side, military intelligence officers were picking up strange radio transmissions from the American forces. The transmissions were clearly voice communications, not Morse code, not machine-generated signals, but human voices speaking into radios. But the language was like nothing the Japanese cryptanalysts had ever encountered. It wasn't English. It wasn't Spanish or French or any European language. It wasn't Chinese or Korean or any Asian language. It wasn't any Pacific Island language the Japanese had cataloged in their years of imperial expansion across the region. The Japanese recorded the transmissions and sent them to their finest codebreakers. These were men who had cracked American, British, and Australian codes. They were men of formidable intelligence and relentless determination. They set to work on the mysterious transmissions with every tool at their disposal. They got nowhere. The tonal nature of the language baffled them. The same combination of sounds seemed to mean different things depending on subtle variations in pitch that their ears couldn't reliably distinguish. The structure of the language followed no grammatical pattern they could identify. There were no recognizable cognates, no borrowed words, no points of reference that could serve as a foothold for analysis. They tried frequency analysis, counting how often certain sounds appeared, looking for patterns that might correspond to common letters or words. The multiple word substitution system defeated this approach completely. Because each English letter could be represented by 3 different Navajo words, and because the code talkers varied their choices randomly, no exploitable pattern emerged. They tried to find native speakers. Japanese intelligence network, which stretched across Asia and the Pacific, was tasked with finding anyone who might recognize the language. They failed. The Navajo language had never traveled beyond the borders of the American Southwest. There were no Navajo people in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, anywhere in the world except the United States. The Japanese even tried using Navajo prisoners. They had none, of course. There were no Navajo people in any Japanese-occupied territory. But they did attempt to use other captured Native American soldiers, hoping that different Native American languages might be similar enough to provide a key. This too failed utterly. The Navajo language was as different from other Native American languages, from Lakota, from Cherokee, from Choctaw, as Mandarin Chinese is to Finnish. A Lakota speaker listening to Navajo would understand exactly nothing. The Japanese codebreakers, for the first and only time in the war, were completely, totally, and absolutely helpless. Major General Howard Connor, who would later command the entire signal operation during the Battle of Iwo Jima, was blunt in his assessment. The Japanese, he said, never broke the Navajo Code. They never came close. Part 5. The Code in Battle. Chapter 9. Tarawa. Blood in the Water. November 1943. The tiny atoll of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands became the site of one of the most horrific amphibious assaults of the war. The Marines knew it would be bad. Tarawa was a fortress. The Japanese commander, Keiji Shibasaki, had boasted that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The island was ringed with concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, and interlocking fields of machine gun fire. The coral reef surrounding the atoll meant that many landing craft grounded hundreds of yards from shore, forcing Marines to wade through chest-deep water under withering fire. The code talkers were there, wading through that same water, carrying their radios above their heads, transmitting coordinates and casualty reports and ammunition requests, while bullets snapped past their ears and mortar rounds sent geysers of seawater into the air around them.
The battle lasted 76 hours. Over 1,000 Marines were killed, and more than 2,000 were wounded. But the code talkers kept the communications flowing, fast, accurate, and completely secure. Japanese defenders who had prepared so meticulously for the American assault found that their intelligence was going dark. They could hear the American radio transmissions, but they could extract no useful information from them. Tarawa was taken. The cost was terrible, but the code had held. Chapter 10. Saipan and the Expanding War. By 1944, the Navajo Code Talker program had proven itself beyond any reasonable doubt, and the Marines were deploying code talkers to every major operation in the Pacific. At Saipan, in June and July of 1944, Code Talkers operated around the clock during one of the most intense campaigns of the war. The battle for Saipan was significant not just militarily, but psychologically. It was part of the Mariana Islands chain, and its capture would put American B-29 bombers within striking distance of the Japanese home islands for the first time. The Japanese fought with desperate fury. They launched massive banzai charges, suicidal infantry attacks designed to overwhelm American positions through sheer numbers and ferocity. During these attacks, communication between Marine units was critical. Units needed to coordinate their defensive fire, call for artillery support, request reinforcements, and report breaches in their lines. The Code Talkers made this possible. While the chaos of battle raged around them, the screaming, the explosions, the terrible sounds of close combat, the Code Talkers sat at their radios and spoke in the calm, measured tones of Diné Bizad, relaying information that saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of American lives. One Code Talker, whose name has been lost to the chaos of war records, reportedly transmitted over 800 messages during a single 48-hour period at Saipan without a single error. 800 messages, 48 hours, 0 errors, under combat conditions. The human mind boggles at the concentration, the endurance, and the courage that such a feat required. Chapter 11. Peleliu, the Forgotten Hell. September 1944. Peleliu. If there is a battle in the Pacific War that embodies the pure, distilled essence of hell on earth, it is Peleliu. This tiny island in the Palau chain, just 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, was honeycombed with over 500 caves and tunnels that the Japanese had turned into an interconnected fortress. The temperature regularly exceeded 115 degrees Fahrenheit. There was almost no fresh water. The coral rock that made up the island tore through boots, clothing, and flesh. The battle was supposed to last 4 days. It lasted over 2 months. The Code Talkers at Peleliu operated in conditions that would have broken lesser men. They crouched in shallow coral foxholes, their radios crackling with static and their mouths dry with thirst, transmitting messages while Japanese snipers hunted them specifically, because the Japanese had learned to identify radio operators as high-value targets. The Japanese couldn't break the code, but they could try to silence the Code Talkers, and so the Code Talkers became marked men, hunted by enemy snipers and targeted by mortar teams. Their casualty rate was significant. Several Code Talkers were killed or wounded at Peleliu. But the code held. The code always held. Chapter 12. Iwo Jima, the code's finest hour. February 19th. The black sand beaches of Iwo Jima. This was the battle where the Navajo Code Talkers achieved their greatest glory, where their contribution was so critical, so indispensable, that senior Marine officers would later state flatly that without the Code Talkers, Iwo Jima could not have been taken. Iwo Jima was a nightmare. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic rock, honeycombed with 11 miles of tunnels, defended by 21,000 Japanese soldiers under the command of General Tadamichi Kudabayashi, one of the most brilliant defensive tacticians in military history. Kudabayashi had designed a defense in depth, a system of interconnected bunkers, pillboxes, and fighting positions that turned every square yard of the island into a killing zone. The Marines landed on the morning of February 19th and immediately walked into a firestorm. The initial waves of troops were allowed to advance inland before Kudabayashi sprung his trap, opening fire from positions that seemed to cover every inch of the beach. The carnage was immediate and apocalyptic. 6 Navajo Code Talkers were assigned to each Marine division at Iwo Jima. From the moment the first Marines hit the beach, the Code Talkers were transmitting. They worked in continuous shifts around the clock for the first 48 hours of the battle.
They sent and received over 800 messages during that critical period. Every message was in Navajo code. Every message was transmitted accurately. Not a single message was garbled, misunderstood, or intercepted by the enemy. The Code Talkers coordinated naval gunfire support, calling in devastating barrages from the battleships and cruisers offshore with pinpoint accuracy. They directed airstrikes, guiding Marine corsairs and Navy Hellcats onto Japanese positions. They coordinated the movements of infantry units, preventing the confusion and friendly fire incidents that had plagued earlier operations. They reported the locations of Japanese strongpoints, enabling Marine commanders to focus their firepower where it was needed most. And through it all, the Japanese listened helplessly. Their radios picked up the Navajo transmissions, and their cryptanalysts sat in frustrated silence, unable to extract a single word of useful intelligence from the strange, haunting, beautiful language flowing through the airwaves. Major Howard Connor, who oversaw all signal operations for the 5th Marine Division at Iwo Jima, would later make a statement that has echoed through history. Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. The battle lasted 36 days. Nearly 7,000 Marines were killed, and over 19,000 were wounded. All but 216 of the 21,000 Japanese defenders died. The iconic photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi, perhaps the most famous war photograph ever taken, was made possible in part by the Navajo Code Talkers who coordinated the assault on that blood-soaked volcanic peak. Chapter 13. Okinawa, the Last Great Battle. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa, the last and largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Over 500,000 American troops participated in the battle for Okinawa, which lasted 82 brutal days and resulted in over 12,000 American dead, over 38,000 wounded, and an estimated 110,000 Japanese military killed.
The Code Talkers were there for all of it. By this point in the war, the Navajo Code had been expanded and refined multiple times. The vocabulary had grown from its original 211 terms to over 600. The Code Talkers themselves had become seasoned combat veterans, men who had survived Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and now Okinawa. They had seen more death, endured more hardship, and demonstrated more courage than most human beings could imagine. At Okinawa, the Code Talkers faced a new threat: kamikaze attacks. Japanese suicide planes targeted the American fleet offshore, and the Code Talkers were essential in coordinating the anti-aircraft defense and the movement of ships. Their rapid, secure communications helped save countless sailors and Marines from the terrible rain of fire that fell from the sky. The code held, as it always had, as it always would. Not once, not a single time in the entire Pacific War was the Navajo Code broken. It stands as the only spoken military code in modern history that was never deciphered. Part 6. The Silence After the Storm. Chapter 14. Victory and Secrecy. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally surrendered, ending the deadliest conflict in human history. The Code Talkers came home. But they came home to silence. The Navajo Code Talker program was classified, top secret. The military wanted to keep the code available for potential use in future conflicts. The Code Talkers were told in no uncertain terms that they could not speak about what they had done. They could not tell their families. They could not tell their friends. They could not tell anyone. And so these men,
These heroes who had helped win the war in the Pacific, who had saved thousands of American lives, whose unbreakable code had confounded the finest minds of the Japanese Empire, went home to the Navajo reservation and said nothing. They went home to poverty. The reservation had no running water, no electricity, no paved roads. There were no jobs. The Indian Health Service was underfunded and overwhelmed. Many code talkers returned to herding sheep, the same work they had done before the war. They went home to discrimination. Despite their service, despite their sacrifice, the Navajo people were still not full citizens of the United States. In some states, they could not vote. They could not buy alcohol. Not that this was entirely a bad thing, but it was a restriction imposed on them that was not imposed on white citizens, and it stung. They were turned away from restaurants, denied service at gas stations, called names on the streets of border towns. And they went home to psychological wounds that they could not speak about because they could not speak about the experiences that had caused them. Many code talkers suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, the nightmares, the flashbacks, the sudden rages, the inability to feel joy or connection. But they had been ordered to keep their experiences secret, and they were Marines, and Marines follow orders. They suffered in silence for 23 years. Chapter 15. The Truth Comes to Light. In 1968, the Navajo Code was finally declassified. Slowly, haltingly, the story began to emerge. Journalists tracked down surviving code talkers. Historians began piecing together the record. The men who had kept their secret for over 2 decades finally began to speak. But recognition was slow in coming. It wasn't until 1982, 37 years after the war, that the United States government officially acknowledged the code talkers' contribution. President Ronald Reagan declared August 14, 1982, as National Navajo Code Talkers Day. It wasn't until 2001, 56 years after the war, that the original 29 code talkers were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States Congress can bestow. The remaining code talkers received Congressional Silver Medals. By then, most of the code talkers had died. Many had died in poverty and obscurity, never having received any recognition for their extraordinary service. Of the 29 original code talkers, only 5 were still alive to receive their medals in person. President George Bush presented the medals in a ceremony at the Capitol building. The surviving code talkers, elderly men in their 80s, stood in the rotunda of the nation's Capitol building, a building they had helped protect from the threat of fascism, and received at last the honor they had earned with their blood, their courage, and their unbreakable language. Part 7. Legacy. Chapter 16. The Meaning of Their Sacrifice. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers is not just a war story. It is not just a story about cryptography or military communications. It is a story about identity, about resilience, about the indomitable strength of a people and a culture that survived everything that was thrown at them: genocide, forced relocation, cultural destruction, poverty, discrimination, and emerged not just intact, but triumphant. The Navajo language, the language that the United States government had tried to eradicate, the language that children had been beaten for speaking, the language that was dismissed as primitive and useless, turned out to be one of the most sophisticated and valuable tools in the American arsenal. The code talkers proved something that should never have needed proving, that the Navajo people, their culture, and their language were not obstacles to be overcome, but treasures to be cherished. Today, the Navajo Code Talkers are recognized as some of the greatest heroes of World War II. Monuments stand in their honor. Schools and buildings bear their names. Their story is taught in classrooms across America and around the world. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Code Talkers is not what they did in war, but what they represent in peace. They represent the truth that diversity is not weakness, but strength. They represent the truth that the things that make us different, our languages, our cultures, our traditions, are not problems to be solved, but gifts to be celebrated.
The Navajo language nearly died. The boarding schools nearly killed it. But it survived in the hearts and minds and voices of the Dene people. And in its survival, it saved the lives of thousands. As of today, efforts are underway to preserve and revitalize the Navajo language. Immersion schools teach young Navajo children to speak Dene Bizad as their first language. Navajo language apps and online resources make the language accessible to a new generation. The Code Talkers story has inspired a renewed pride in the language among the Navajo people. The last of the original 29 Code Talkers, Chester Nez, passed away on June 4, 2014, at the age of 93. Before his death, he authored a memoir called Code Talker, in which he reflected on his extraordinary life and the meaning of his service. "Our Navajo code was never broken," Chester Nez wrote, "and I am so proud of that. We were the only ones who could do it. Our language saved lives. Our language helped win the war. And after all those years when they tried to take our language away from us, it turned out that our language was the most valuable thing we had." The wind still blows across the mesas and canyons of Dinetah. The 4 sacred mountains still stand, and the Navajo language, ancient, beautiful, complex beyond measure, still lives on the lips of the people. It is a language that was nearly silenced. It is a language that saved the world, and it is a language that will never, ever be broken.